thank you all for being here. Some of you have, I think, a kind of direct analog in the films. There's a public defender in the films, Tom. There's a judge in the films, Elizabeth. And I think Khalil and Travis, you also, of course, can see trauma in the faces and in the experiences of the people in the films. Travis, could you start us out by just telling us, what do we know about trauma in jails? What do we know about the predator-prey dynamic, that you have to be one or the other? I think we have somebody who was in Rikers in the films, and then someone who was a corrections officer at Rikers. Both of them have expressed, or one of them, his mother, expresses the trauma that each of those roles entails.
Absolutely. Thank you, Carol. So as I had a chance to watch these 6 videos about very powerful events in people's lives, the thing that it takes me back to is, in the trauma training that we do with jurisdictions around the country, we talk about a saying by a gentleman who's an American author and Nobel Prize laureate. He died in 1962, but his name is William Faulkner. In one of his publications, he wrote, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." And what that takes me back to in the correction system is the years that I've spent working in state prisons as well as in county jails, is hearing people tell their stories. Yeah, I can think very vividly to a group 15 to 18 years ago that I was a part of, and I had a woman say to me, "Travis, you know that thing that I talked about in group today? It happened to me 25, 30 years ago, but it's still with me today like it just happened to me yesterday." And that's what I see in so many of these videos that are up here. We hear from men in some of the videos that we show when we do our trauma training, who one day the light bulb went on when they were talking about being bullied while they were not only in the community but also serving time in our local jails and in state prison systems, where when that light bulb went off, it was, I realized, as scared as I was, those people that were bullying me were just as scared as me. And it was that day when I finally grew sick and tired of being the prey that I had a decision to make. It was either predator or prey. And I was tired of being the prey. And that switch went on, like you talked about in some of these videos, Carol. We did one of the things that we know, and there's been a lot of prevalence studies done regarding trauma, not only in the general population, but as we know when it comes to prevalence studies, when you take something that's already bad and you try to take it from the general population into a corrections environment, usually the numbers or the percentages get worse. And we did a study on 20 jail diversion sites from 2002 to 2007, and there were a little over 2,100 participants that took place in this trauma study of jail diversion programs. And there were a couple of things that came out of that study that really surprised us. One is we expected to see a somewhat significant difference in prevalence rates of trauma, and we're talking about things like experiencing physical violence and sexual assault. We expected to see somewhat significant differences between men and women, and that didn't end up being the case. Lifetime prevalence rates for women, we found, were 96% of those that were in the justice system. An 89% lifetime prevalence rate for men. When we looked at just the last year leading up to their arrests before they became involved in jail diversion programs, it was 3 out of every 4 women and 8.5 out of every 10 men that had experienced that physical violence or sexual assault leading up to that most recent incarceration. So I bring that back to that William Faulkner saying of the past is never dead. It's not even past, because we find that not only are people dealing with things that have happened to them years and decades ago, but as some of the research has shown, it's still happening right now today. The people that you are working with day in and day out in your local justice systems, they're experiencing that trauma right now as you're working with them. And so if there's just one sentence that I could add, in the medical field, we talk about taking universal precautions to prevent the transmission of communicable diseases. We wear masks, we put on gloves. But it's really important when we think about trauma in the criminal justice system that we adopt what we like to call a universal assumption. And it's that assumption that every single person you are coming into contact with has not just a history of trauma, but a significant history of trauma in their lives.
Thank you, Travis. Is that, Khalil, can you talk a little bit about this, about how do you see the possibility for creating a system that does not mete out such trauma? And is part of the goal of what you're trying to do to help people put the past behind them? What does one do with a past that includes significant trauma?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, and thank you for inviting me and having me here. If I could just address something that I think I just want the audience to be very mindful of is I don't want there to be a false dichotomy of predator or prey, that somehow the trauma that we're talking about is solely at the hands of the people being detained in these facilities. The reality is that exposure to the criminal justice system by itself is traumatic. Being falsely accused of stealing a backpack at 16 years old is traumatic. And all of the stuff that therefore comes with that, even violence and sexual assault that's perpetuated or perpetrated, I should say, by the hands of correctional staff is also traumatic. And so while there is a violent aspect of jails in general, because when you put people in frustrating positions, surprise, surprise, they get violent, they get upset. And so I don't want it to just sound like the people that we're talking about in these facilities, that somehow they have to be predator or prey. The reality is that instead of focusing on the people in the barrel, we should be focusing on the barrel itself. And so that kind of prefaces my answer to the question, is that if we are truly going to be talking about ways to minimize trauma for people, then we also have to talk about really sustainable ways to divert people away from systems. And not only alternatives to incarceration, which I all too often feel is a buzz term that means different things in different jurisdictions across the country, but also alternatives to prosecution. Because there is a difference to understand, and there is a difference in the ask of what we're asking for in terms of how we implement dollars behind those ideas. And so at Fortune, obviously, we are in the business of giving people access to resources. I wouldn't say we're in the business of trying to fix people. I wouldn't say we're in the business of trying to over-paternalize people. I would say that we're in the business of expanding access to resources. Mental health treatment is one of them. A stable, affordable housing is another. But also giving people access to something I think is just as important and empowering for people who have had direct experience with the criminal justice system is access to other people who have survived that experience. I mean, there are a ton of other scenarios that we can name that once a survivor of that has access to other people who survived that, the likelihood of them surviving that trauma that's related to that experience expands dramatically, because you have someone now to help you navigate a process that you somehow feel is insurmountable, and you can't navigate it on your own. And so at Fortune, we have a 50-year history of doing that, but also that we have a 50-year history of looking to the people most directly impacted by the issues that we're talking about to play roles, lead roles, in many respects, in helping people have access to not only expanded opportunity, but also having access to this peer network, so to speak, of people who have, and I say peer meaning people who have had the same lived experience, whether that's with homelessness, chronic homelessness, or if it's with mental illness, substance abuse, or in many respects, unfortunately, incarceration.
Thank you. Tom, can you talk a little bit about diverting away from the system? I think Khalil has really raised one of the key elements in avoidance of trauma or minimization of trauma, which is how to actually minimize contact with the system as it exists. Is that something that you're engaged in Milwaukee, and how do you view this issue of trauma?
Well, I think that, in all the work that the Safety and Justice Challenge has brought to all the different sites, I'm sure we could make a long list of various projects which are intended to take people who otherwise would flow into the criminal justice system through its way of doing business, and finding some place outside of the criminal justice system to address the things that are causing difficulty. And there's no question that if we are going to be committed to criminal justice reform, we have to solve our problems without this attempt to intimidate people and to show how aversive, the consequences are going to be if you get yourself into trouble. But I think we're really missing a deeper thread here. I'd just like to take a second and talk about it. As human beings, the thing that is easiest for us to be affected by is our fears. And there isn't anybody in this room who doesn't have fears, and most people have had at least one or more experiences in their life where they've been truly afraid that something terrible was going to happen. And sadly, in many instances, terrible things have happened. You know, that fear, that deep, powerful fear is something that just does damage to our brains. I mean, I think one thing to understand about trauma is it's an injury to the brain. And it's not something which you just get over because you decide you're going to get over. It requires a lot more. And I think it's also important to say that trauma comes in different forms. So there's primary trauma, the things that happen to you, and there are secondary traumas, the things that you see happening to other people that you care about, and traumas that didn't really actually happen to you, but you thought they might. And I don't think there's anybody doing this work who in one form or another is not experiencing, this kind of thing. And what we have to recognize is that the greater the degree of trauma, the poorer your ability to think clearly, to respond wisely to things. And I can tell you, in doing the work that our lawyers do, until 5, 6, 7 years ago, we never talked about trauma. And we just looked at a lot of behaviors that clients brought to us, and frankly, our own behaviors and the behaviors that we would see in these courtrooms without a trauma lens. And because we didn't ask the right kinds of questions, we simply misunderstood what it was that was happening. We misunderstood the sophisticated adaptation that a lot of clients have brought to a life that is confronting them with really unimaginably difficult choices. And because we didn't understand those things and we didn't talk about them, we didn't ask people what happened to them, we didn't try to understand how this set of behaviors that were causing bench warrants and all sorts of difficulties in court were really something we could help this person work on. And opening the understanding of trauma has changed in fundamental ways, and it needs to change for generations to come, the way we think about what it is that we're dealing with. And if there isn't a judge and a prosecutor and a public defender and bailiff and jailer, if all those people don't really rethink what they're doing in light of this trauma knowledge, we are going to continue to produce the exact same kinds of outcomes that we're producing now. And it's just unacceptable.
That sounds like a tall order. Everyone in the system needs to be more aware of trauma in order for us to change this system. Elizabeth, maybe you can talk about how you have come to understand the prevalence of trauma in your 10 years on the bench and how you're able to react to it as a key part. You wear the robes, like Judge Padro says.
So in Mecklenburg County about 8 years ago, I came to be, I think, affectionately known as CTJ, the crazy trauma judge, because I was presiding over an exclusively juvenile docket, including delinquency and child welfare cases, and I had come to really understand traumatic stress as an injury that does affect how the brain operates, that really triggers a stress response that is sort of a default setting, for people who've experienced chronic stress and repeated experiences of their system just being overwhelmed by powerlessness and stress. So when I came to understand that, and I started ordering all kinds of things that I decided were necessary to create optimal conditions for healing and resilience, and nobody understood what the heck I was talking about, they decided that I was CTJ, the crazy trauma judge. Since then, we've come a long way in really understanding what trauma is and what it looks like. And it often can look like disobedience, disrespect, recalcitrance, disruptive, disorderly behavior. And if we continue to respond to those behaviors in our typical authoritative, controlling ways, then we continue to get really negative outcomes, like people who become dysregulated in the courtroom and end up being held in contempt and jailed for 5 or 10 days because they could not calm themselves down to have a rational conversation with the judge. So just to give I'm just going to give an example of, because, while I, want, like Tom, everyone to understand it and to understand what it looks like and how maybe to adjust their response, that's going to take time to build that kind of infrastructure across all of the disciplines. But there are things that I can do in my role as a judge. So one example, in adult criminal court, I was presiding over what we call our private warrant court. North Carolina is one of the only states in the country where you can just go down to the magistrate and get somebody arrested without a police officer getting involved and just, say this person stole my money or hit me or whatever. So we have a separate court and we do mediations and all this other kind of stuff. And it's a huge docket, it goes all day. So this one particular day, we've worked through over 4 hours the docket, and I've noticed in the last hour this one woman sitting in the very back of the courtroom right next to the door, and she is agitated. I mean, she's just visibly agitated. She's like kind of moving around, jumping around in her seat. She's kind of jumping every time somebody's, coming in and out of the door. And I'm watching her, and I see that she's, clearly upset. And eventually, the prosecutor has cleared all the cases out of the courtroom. Everybody's gone except for her. And they call her up to the defense table, and they tell me that she was late, and the prosecuting witness, the person who sought the charge, wasn't there, was never there. And they just want to give her a new court date, but she won't accept that, so she wants to oppose. And I mean, she's interrupting them, she's trying to approach the bench, she's snapping her teeth and got her hands on her hips, and before I can even get any words out to just kind of talk to her about what the situation is, she's just agitated and starts yelling at me. About this prosecuting witness, and I have to go to work, and and I've got my baby down in the daycare, and she's taken out 3 warrants on me, and they've all been dismissed. She never comes to court, and I'm going to lose and she's just going, she's getting pretty wild. And the deputies start moving in behind her because they're like, this girl's about to be held in contempt because she's out of control and interrupting the judge. And I look at him, and I'm like, just don't do that. So they walk away and give her space because crowding in on her would probably make her feel even more stressed and agitated. So I just, could have done what I might do at the end of a long day and a long docket and be impatient and kind of like, listen here, lady, you just need to listen to what I have to say, like take your court date and let's get out of here. But I stopped and I listened, repeated back some of the concerns that that I heard her say, like she's got to get to work, she's been waiting, she was held to the last, okay, well, you say she's done this. So I asked the clerk, well, let's look it up and see, was there, give me the thing, was this person subpoenaed? And took some time to just listen and look at it, and she calmed down because I stayed calm and listened, and walked her through the steps of what her concerns were, and we were actually able to resolve her case with a dismissal and send her on her way. But that behavior that she had that whole time would typically trigger admonishment from the court, potential contempt sanctions, and going with the deputy into a holding cell to be processed into the jail. But while I can't tell you what specific history of chronic stress this woman has experienced, I took universal precautions and assumed this person is in this courtroom. I assume that she is, financially stressed. She's stressed about her experience here today and how she's been treated. And so I will recognize all of those behaviors as part of a chronic stress response, that she's feeling a little dysregulated and having trouble managing that stress in this situation.
I think that's an absolutely fascinating anecdote, and it calls to mind what you used the word earlier, Khalil, which is paternalism, that the Fortune Society is trying not to work in a paternalistic way with its clients. And there is something in what all of you are saying about, I don't want to use the word patriarchy so early in these sessions, but the way our system functions, top-down, interested in control, and what you're really proposing at its heart is something with a fundamentally different structure and a different perception of itself vis-a-vis the clients who enter into contact with it. How do we create such a huge revolution in the system? It sounds in some ways so antithetical to the way justice has always been dispensed in this country.
So, I think there's been a great deal of work done on the term procedural justice. And, this is really, I think, one of the most important foundational steps to having a trauma-informed criminal justice system. Because procedural justice at its root is really about treating people with respect and dignity when they enter a courtroom. But frankly, there's in another set of these grant projects, this really powerful phrase that every contact in the criminal justice system is an opportunity to reduce harm. And we should live by that, and that's, should be a driving principle for every interaction that we have, right? Procedural justice, though, is, I think, something that changes the way that things happen in courtrooms. And I can tell you as a lawyer, I can tell when I'm handling a case that's going to sentencing and there's a lot at stake for clients. There always is, but I want to focus on cases where there's, a person might be going to prison or not. I can tell almost immediately whether we're going to get the outcome we're hoping for or not by the way the judge begins the remarks that are going to be, used to explain the sentence. And when we're in the register that speaks to the person's dignity, that speaks to the humanity of what's happened, which recognizes, I can see, Mr. Smith, why it is that, you thought that you should react the way you did, notwithstanding the dangers it posed. When we're in that register, even though the clients don't know it, and oftentimes this is a trauma response, the clients can't hear what's happening. I've had clients time and time again, the judge puts them on probation, says, I'm sentencing you to 5 years in the state prison. I'm staying that sentence and putting you on probation. And they're convinced because they hear that 5 years in prison, that's it. And they're just, and you're trying to reach over and say, no, look, it's not what you think. But what I want to say is that when you're in that register that respects people and respects their dignity, then it's not possible to do mean and vindictive things. It's not possible to sort of lose sight of the human moment that this is. Procedural justice is about retraining ourselves to think differently about how we communicate at this really critical juncture. And by communicating in a different register, one that allows the voice of the person who's affected to be heard, that respects their dignity, what you do is you change the human interaction. And really the essence of really great defense sentencing arguments is getting judges, I won't say manipulating, but kind of helping judges to be in that register when they're thinking about your client. To accomplish some of this, through the MacArthur grant, we have a community center in Milwaukee that has this marvelous partnership around domestic violence. So the Children's Hospital and all the victims, groups and DAs and a whole bunch of other community entities have come together, built a lovely facility, and it's very trauma-informed. And the people who participated in creating that, I think, had a lot of influence on our interest in trauma. When we got this grant, we wrote into the application, and we subsequently trained over 400 people in our criminal justice system, 4 hours at a time. Travis, came a couple times to teach us how to do this, showing the kinds of video material that you saw here, powerful, powerful stuff. and then forcing people into discussions about knowing that this is what you're seeing, how can we change a little bit of what we're doing. That's the beginning. This is an iterative process. It's a continuous kind of learning. We have to tame the system by changing what we're doing, and we have to be really committed to it. But I would say if we push procedural justice and this trauma knowledge out there, we will, just by that fact alone, have a great potential for positive change.
Travis, I think Thomas just made an advertisement for what you do. Maybe you want to follow up.
I would like to add something, and thank you, Tom, for what you had to say, because I think it's important that as we look at systemic change, it's not just the justice system. It's all the systems that a person comes into contact with who touches the justice system. It's across what we think of as the sequential intercept model. So that contact with law enforcement, that booking into the jail, that first appearance in court, if the person continues to stay in jail or they get out on pretrial and they're under supervision, if they get out through a specialty court, a mental health court, a drug court, at the point of reentry, when a person's reentering back into the community. It's all those points, because we have to understand the ripple effect, that unintentional trauma. We know that there's sometimes intentional trauma that occurs within the justice system, but that unintentional trauma, that if I'm a judge in court and I have somebody standing before me who's obviously displaying the symptoms of trauma, it's to my benefit in that leadership position to advocate to all of my partners across the justice system about what being trauma-informed will do for them, because the ripple effect is felt throughout all pieces of the justice system. It's also important for people like me who have made a career out of this intersection of behavioral health and justice to realize that I don't want people walking into my agency, whether it's before they're coming into contact with the justice system, while they're having that contact, or post-contact with the justice system. Nobody should have to walk in the front door of my agency and tell their trauma story 3, 4, 5, 6 times to different people because I'm doing an intake. Now I'm seeing a doctor. Now I'm seeing my case manager. Now I'm seeing the peer specialist, my therapist. We have to find a more universal and uniformed way for people to tell the powerful life events that they have endured, that they are trying to come out the other side of, and to get help with that, but not have to re-traumatize themselves time and time again, because we will feel that ripple effect throughout the system.
Can I just push you on that? What is the way, actually? I mean, literally, how do you do that? Is it through a video that can be shown to people at different, so the person doesn't have to recount it, but there's a recording of it?
What we're seeing is a lot better utilization of things like an electronic health record, of capturing information of people, that instead of, if that intake worker did a very thorough job of collecting that information, which they should do, instead of me sitting down and saying, okay, tell me your story, it's me actually taking the time to read that intake, that information. Because we do. Behavioral health, we're just as guilty of it as any part of the system, of re-traumatizing people unintentionally. When I was the deputy director of county mental health where I live, as I look back in hindsight, I'm disgusted at how we unintentionally re-traumatize people time and time again.
Yeah, and then I would add that treating people with humanity and dignity is important, undoubtedly. But I also feel that the system lets go of that the moment that someone is perceived to be, acting out in a certain way. And I think those are the moments that the system in general has to understand, like that is the moment where you have to actually double down on your treating someone with humanity and respect, because that person is frustrated. And that frustration all too often doesn't come unprovoked in many respects. And then so I don't know what the answer is to the question, particularly about what type of system it should look like, but I do know.
Treating each other with a lack of respect, lack of courtesy, shutting down, cutting people off, counsel, all this kind of ugliness of spirit. When people are treating each other that way, first thing, if my client feels like if my lawyer's getting treated this way, boy, am I in trouble. That's the one way of thinking about it. The family who's sitting behind, and these, we've had more and more barricades and thick plastic windows and every other kind of thing put in these courtrooms. People sitting behind there think, when the bailiff and the clerk are talking in catty ways about things, you know, oh boy, is my son or daughter in a lot of trouble while they're waiting for their case. If we don't change the way people, you know, treat each other and respect how difficult it is to do this work, then it's really unfair to think that the people who have been harmed by the jobs that they have, that they're magically going to also be able to, because they now understand how important trauma is, to change the way that they interact with the people who they have responsibility for. And so the whole system has to be humanized in a way that reflects these values. It needs to feel like a place where problems are solved, where remediation is possible, where something positive is occurring. And maybe one other point of reference in thinking about this is the really powerful work that's being done in restorative justice. Because what restorative justice teaches us is that when something terrible happens, the harm radiates out in all directions. And if we're serious about trying to make things better, what we have to be committed to is repairing that harm in all the directions that it flows. Because if you don't, if you just say, well, we're going to solve the harm by holding this individual accountable, and we're going to ignore all that other harm, that's all the harm that's laying the foundation for the next bad thing that's happened, and the next. So we just have to reorganize our thinking about what we're doing.
Judge Trosch, did you want to come in on this point, or in following on what Khalil was saying earlier?
I don't even know I think we're on the question of what does a trauma-informed system look like? Is that the question one? I think, you know, it's not so much about screening, assessment, and treatment can be part of it, but I think that this trauma-informed system kind of helps create conditions in which people are able to build their resilience. So that system would create psychological safety. It would be a system where I come into a courtroom and I don't feel overwhelmed and stressed, but I have some sense that I'm psychologically safe in this space. And that comes with the humanity and the dignity. I mean, we always say that people who've been impacted by traumatic stress need three things. They need psychological safety, they need connection, and they need agency. They need to feel psychologically safe where they are. They need to have connection to safe, supportive people, whoever that is, hopefully defense attorneys and others involved in providing services, and then a sense of agency where they're able to articulate what it is that they need in order to thrive. And sometimes it's not what we think they need or what our program provides or what we're prepared to offer based on the symptom that we see.
You know, I wanted to ask, because Khalil mentioned, you know, taking the time to listen to people, and Travis talked about taking the time to actually read the file, and you talked about spending hours in trauma training. And we know from the judge's video, and you know from your own experience, how little time you have in your day. And how does the system actually create time to listen, to read, to train? You talked about slowing it down and trying to really understand what that woman was going through. That took time.
If you feel like you can't,
then
do what you have to do to be able to do it. I mean, I'll be very honest. I was in juvenile court for 7 years. I presided over our youth treatment court for 7 years. We fortunately have in our community a mandatory timeout of juvenile court. After 3 or 4 years, you have to come out for at least a year, because we recognize that you just can't have babies and children die, get murdered, and see skull fractures and human trafficking victim minors disappear and not get stressed out. And honestly, not start, like many of us who work in this, in the criminal justice and juvenile justice systems, you could start to kind of feel like this world is a really terrible and scary place where bad things are happening all the time. Where you find yourself at cocktail parties and Sunday school kind of feeling like, I don't know what world you people are a part of, because I don't know how to relate to you. Because I spend my day interacting with a very different experience that people are having. Right? And so part of it is being able to recognize, I'm cutting off the lawyer, I'm getting distracted and kind of like looking at my phone, I'm, looking for my mints or my lotion and not really listening. I'm having compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, vicarious, whatever you want to call it. I have lost my capacity to slow down, to listen, to empathize. And if that's happening, then I need to be able to recognize that, whether it's just in that moment on that day. I need to get off the bench, I've got to go for a walk, I need something to eat, I need to go meditate for a few minutes, or I need to leave what I'm doing for some period of time. Some things we do is schedule the kinds of cases that we know are going to be hard early in the day, when you're fresh, you have energy, and because taking those really hard cases at the end of the day is probably going to decrease the chances that you're able to give it the time and the focus and the attention it deserves.
I want to make sure that the audience is preparing questions, because as soon as Khalil is done speaking, I want anybody here who has a question to please weigh in. So sorry.
Yeah, so while here, I got here yesterday and was here with a group of formerly incarcerated leaders from all across the country, from an organization called Just Leadership USA. Some of them are in the room. And so as a way for us to kind of learn about the city, we went to one of the casinos. And I'm not a gambler. I rarely go to casinos unless it's at a conference. And seriously. And so it was very interesting sitting there at the poker table. I don't play poker. I don't understand it. I was just watching. And every 30 minutes, the dealer would be rotated out. And I can only assume, I know what that's about, right? To just kind of reduce the chance of anyone doing anything underhanded. But imagine if, that just made me think, right? Like the importance we put on a poker dealer's fatigue. And we laugh because we know how ridiculous that sounds, but that is the ideology. A part of it is how overworked this person must be to switch out every 30 minutes. And I'm not making light of that person's role, and there's dignity in all work. But I would dare to assume that the weight of responsibility on a person's life, or many people's lives, because the person in front of you is part of something else, that weight too would require some level of compassion for the fatigue that the most unbiased and compassionate person that's tasked with the most responsibility in that courtroom should also be getting something, should also attention being paid to the level of fatigue and burnout that they face.
And I think that's across the system. I think ideally that as a trauma-informed system does account for the exposure of its actors and the impact of that exposure on the actors and their ability to really maintain those universal precautions effectively. Ideally, public defenders and prosecutors and police detectives and probation officers and corrections officers and judges would have some systemic support to help them manage that stress that they're exposed to every day.
Well, and not to mention the stress that I think many people in this room who may be advocates or policy experts also feel. This is a tough subject. It's a tough sector in which we work. And I think everyone can experience burnout and stress. I don't want to compare the stress that I might feel in my job to what Mrs. Jackson feels after her son was murdered. It's not about making any kind of equivalence between those experiences, but I think we all have to recognize that probably everyone in this room is in a job that exposes them to tough stuff. And I hope everyone here is taking some time for self-care. I hope you've also taken a little bit of time to think of any questions you might have for the panel. Yes, ma'am. Oh, kids? Oh, wow.
Hi. Whoa.
Wow.
Sorry. I'm Mai Fernandez. I'm with the National Center for Victims of Crime. And the MacArthur Foundation last year let us do roundtables all over the different sites. And we came up with 8 principles of how to involve victims in criminal justice reform. And I think principle number 3 was acknowledging that depending on the day, a person can be a defendant one day and a victim the next. And that most of the people in the criminal justice system have trauma, and that we need more trauma-informed services available to people in the jail system, in the prison system, in the law enforcement system. One of the things I want to advocate for, again, this is not so much of a question but a pitch, is that VOCA funds, which is the Victim of Crime Act funds, are now available for people inside the jail system or inside the prison system. There is also an enormous amount of VOCA funds available this year. You should all go to your states and your state VOCA directors and say, we want funds to help victims that have people who have been previously victimized that are now in a jail system. You should also figure out how to provide services for those people as they're exiting the jail system so that they can get hooked up with their victim services as they go out the door. So it was more of everything that you've said, we talk about in the victims world all the time, but it's the acknowledgement that depending on the day, somebody can be looked upon as an offender or a victim, and they all have deep trauma.
Thank you. That's a very important point. Any other questions from the floor? Are you all just thinking about getting back out and getting some popcorn? That was really good, wasn't it? Well, if I could take the chair. Is there one? Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm part of Just Leadership USA, but I'm also an EMDR therapy provider. One thing that wasn't said is that people actually need to reprocess traumatic experiences as part of their treatment. I'm wondering which service providers, organizations, or psychotherapists you're hooking up people with while they're incarcerated so that they can start their trauma treatment on the inside.
Any insight?
We do have mental health providers in our jail that are able to provide evidence-based trauma treatments.
I have a question, Tom.
I'm sorry, I don't have the answer. I don't have the specific answer to the question, Lane, but thank you for posing it. I also want to hold you up as someone who is a licensed clinical social worker, someone who has experience, and so that you too can offer a level of expertise and advice that some folks in the room may actually benefit from, because the answer to that question may be, we don't have anything, and so now what do we do? And so I just wanted to highlight that for you.
Can I add one thing to that? So we tend to, and rightfully so, we focus on how do we, from a treatment perspective, help people with evidence-based practices to work through their trauma. We frequently talk about how, when we experience a crisis, it's a bit easier to kind of pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off. But when we experience trauma, it's like the pieces of our life shatter. And we're never going to put those pieces back together the way that they were before. But what we try to do is the best job that we can to put the pieces back together so they have some semblance of what we were like beforehand. And sometimes we become too focused on who's the provider, what's the service, what's the evidence-based practice, when what we're talking about here, and especially on this panel, is something that's far broader reaching than that, and that is, what does everybody, whether you have a clinical background or not, what is your role in this justice system, whether you're a peer specialist, whether you're a correctional officer, whether you're the warden of a prison, whatever your role may be, what is your role in creating a more trauma-informed system so that really at least a minimum of two things happen. People aren't being intentionally or unintentionally re-traumatized when they come back in the justice system, but that also we're hoping that people in their journey towards recovery are having fewer and fewer contacts with the justice system, especially in a more trauma-informed justice system.
A frequent metaphor for trauma is, the image of an iceberg, that the behavior is the tip of the iceberg and that's all we see, and underneath, is this giant iceberg. Well, how do you shrink an iceberg? You warm the water, and that's who we are, we're the water. And so we've got to create that environment that shrinks the iceberg, that reduces some of those, one of the ways I've heard it described that I think is so accurate is totally normal response to some pretty abnormal situations that becomes maladaptive in other spaces. And so if we're going to shrink that iceberg so that that person can be more adaptive in their environment, then we have to warm the water by changing how each and every one of us is viewing and interacting with those individuals.
Can we pause a second to ask about really, literally, how is that done? We're gathered here as people maybe with some similar opinions, maybe not 100%, but about how the system needs to change and how the iceberg needs to shrink. But we know that the system as a whole is not in this ballroom and does not see the world the way we do. You said that 6 or 7 years ago, people weren't even talking about trauma, Tom, but now they are. So what is it that propels that kind of change in narrative? How do we create that and make it happen?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of thoughts I have about this. The first is the criminal justice system has been focused unduly on a single metric, which I think is the adjudication of cases. If I'm a police officer, did I make an arrest? Did the DA charge the case? If I'm a judge, am I managing my docket? And lawyers in both sides of the criminal justice system are given assignments about how many cases. It's all about cases. And it's very little about system outcomes. And we as a society have come to recognize that the system outcomes are absolutely terrible. Whether you want to adopt the term mass imprisonment, I don't think it's a good term, but you can pick whatever term you want. The system outcomes are terrible. They're costly, they're damaging. The stories that were depicted in those really powerful vignettes could be replicated by 100 times or 1,000 times. Who even knows the magnitude of the suffering that's involved? So focusing on system outcomes should then force us to think about how we're doing the business differently. And it seems to me that trauma is a thread that runs through all of this. And if you start to pay attention to it, it gives you the opportunity to think about different system outcomes. The criminal justice system we have has been focused on holding people accountable, and it has used primarily punitive strategies to do that. It has completely abandoned the interest in prevention and in remediation, with the exception of drug treatment courts and a few relatively recent changes. So I think we have to ask ourselves, are we getting the outcomes from the criminal justice system that are making us safer, they're making us healthier, they're making our communities more prosperous? And when the answer to that question is no, then I think you have to ask different questions. And trauma is one of those different questions that has the power to force you to think about a lot of what we're doing in a fundamentally different way.
And then
this will be our final word, because somebody's holding up a sign that says stop.
I would just add as a word of encouragement that we're not actually trying to recreate the wheel. Like, we're not trying to create something different. There are many other systems, some in this country, some in not, that some are not, that we could pull some pieces from in a way to hold someone accountable, but treat them with humanity and dignity throughout the entire process. How certain systems have looked at decriminalization of certain charges, how they've diverted tons of people away from a system, how they've instituted ways to incentivize prosecutors to actually not view that their outcomes for conviction is what should be their goal on a daily basis, how to move correctional systems away from having lack of transparency, how to have police departments operate in a way that is in full communication and translation with community members, and understanding that they can't be occupiers but collaborators. And so there are systems that we can look at. But in the end, out of all of that, here's what I do know, is that until we dramatically shift the perception of who we're talking about when we say things like defendant, victim, community member, all too often there are negative connotations that come with all of that. Even in the most quote-unquote progressive spaces, that people still have negative connotations when they hear certain words, and especially when those words are felon or convict or violent felony offender. Because then that's when, we can do all we want to do for the low-level nonviolent drug offenses, but the moment we get into the hard conversations, it's like, well, except for those people we'll get to later. We'll go after the low-hanging fruit. When the reality is that really just talks to the level of negative perception we have on the people that we're actually talking about, and how fearful we are of what the public will say, what the public in general will say, what the voters will say, what the constituents will say, when the reality is that we have to lead by example. And sometimes that means taking risk, even when it looks the most risky.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on, and Khalil, I appreciate your work.